All of this happened in the fall of 2016, when I was 21. I've never been the kind of guy who turns heads, so my dating life was pretty much non-existent. That changed when I downloaded a dating app called Connect Me. For the first 2 months, I had no luck, just a few matches that fizzled out after a couple of messages. But then, in early November, a woman named Lila messaged me. She had long, dark hair and piercing green eyes in her photos. She was stunning, almost too stunning, but her profile seemed genuine enough. I replied and we started chatting. What struck me as odd was that she didn't message me again until 3 days later. Most bots send follow-ups immediately, but Lila's delay made her seem real. Her profile was sparse, just a few photos and a vague bio that said, "Looking for someone who gets me." I didn't think much of it at the time. We talked for about a month before she suggested I visit her. She lived in a small town called Black Hollow, about 7 hours north of where I was. It was a long drive, but I was smitten. I'd even been daydreaming about asking her if I could come see her. When she brought it up, I didn't hesitate. We'd video chatted a few times, and she always seemed so warm and engaging. I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. But things took a strange turn during the drive. Lila started texting me constantly, asking where I was and if I was still coming. If I took more than 20 minutes to reply, she'd send a flurry of messages. Things like, "Are you okay? And you're not changing your mind, are you?" It was unnerving, but I told myself she was just nervous. After all, I was nervous too. When I finally arrived in Black Hollow, I got lost almost immediately. Her directions were cryptic, referencing landmarks that didn't seem to exist. I drove down winding back roads past abandoned barns and rusted-out cars until I reached a narrow dirt path lined with gnarled trees. The house at the end of the path looked like something out of a horror movie. It was a 2-story Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging roof. One of the upstairs windows was boarded up, and the curtains in the others were drawn tight. Parked in the driveway was Lila's blue pickup truck, which she'd mentioned in our conversations. I texted her, "I'm here," and she replied with a simple, "Come in." As I stepped out of the car, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was unnaturally still, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my feet. I glanced up at the house and froze. There was a face in the upstairs window. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into me. I told myself it was just her dad or a relative, but the way it stared at me made my skin crawl. Lila opened the door before I could knock. She was even more beautiful in person, with a smile that lit up her face. She kissed me on the cheek and led me inside. The house was dimly lit, with heavy furniture and a faint smell of mildew. We sat on the couch, and she asked if I wanted something to drink. As we talked, I casually mentioned the person I'd seen upstairs. Her smile vanished. "My dad's not here," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been alone all day." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. "Come on, I saw someone in the window. They were staring right at me." Her face went pale. "We need to leave. Now." We ran to the car, and I called the police as we drove away. Lila was shaking, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found nothing. Just an open back door and footprints leading into the woods. They told us it was probably a squatter and assured us the house was safe. But Lila refused to go back inside. She begged me to stay with her that night, and I agreed. We slept on the living room floor, with her dad's shotgun propped against the wall. I told her it was overkill, but she insisted. "You didn't see what I saw," she whispered. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps in the kitchen. My heart pounded as I grabbed the shotgun and crept toward the noise. When I flipped on the light, I saw him, the same gaunt figure from the window. He was standing on the other side of the glass door, his face pressed against it. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and his lips were moving like he was trying to say something. I raised the gun, and he bolted into the woods. The police came again, but they found nothing. They suggested we stay somewhere else for the night. Lila went to her cousin's house, and I drove home. As I left, I glanced at the house one last time. There he was, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes burned with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, desperation, maybe even sadness. I never saw Lila again. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual friend that she'd moved out of state. The house in Black Hollow was sold shortly after, but the new owners didn't stay long. They claimed the place was haunted. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do know this. Whoever, or whatever, was in that house that night, it wasn't human. It was a cold, overcast evening in the small town of Black Hollow, nestled deep within the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. The date was October 29th, just 2 days before Halloween, and the air was thick with the scent of damp pine and decaying leaves. My parents, Mr. and Mrs. Grayson, had left for a weekend trip to Seattle, leaving me, 17-year-old Clara Grayson, alone in our creaky old Victorian house. I had just returned from a sleepover at my friend Daniel's house, which had been abruptly canceled after his parents received an unsettling phone call about a family emergency. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it felt like the first sign that something was off. The house was unusually quiet when I arrived, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the floorboards settling. My younger brother, Ethan, was supposed to be home, and I could hear him in his room, shouting at his video game as usual. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I dropped my bag by the door and headed to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. That's when the first strange thing happened. The phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound that echoed through the empty halls. It was Daniel. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was trying to mask his unease. We chatted for a few minutes about the canceled sleepover, and he mentioned something about hearing strange noises outside his house earlier that evening. I brushed it off, thinking he was just trying to spook me for Halloween. But as I hung up, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The house felt colder, darker, as if the shadows were pressing in closer. I walked into the living room, the phone still in my hand, when I heard it. A high-pitched, almost metallic screech that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was faint at first, like the sound of nails dragging across glass, but it grew louder, more insistent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound seemed to move, shifting from room to room, as if it were alive. I tried to follow it, but it was impossible to pinpoint. Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped, replaced by the ringing of the phone again. But this time, the phone wasn't in my hand or on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. It was in the upstairs bathroom, perched precariously on the edge of the sink. I stared at it, my mind racing. I hadn't been upstairs since I got home. I answered the phone, my hand trembling. There was no one on the other end, just static and the faint sound of breathing. I hung up and backed out of the bathroom, my eyes darting around the dimly lit hallway. That's when I heard the crash, a deafening thud that shook the walls. It came from the attic, directly above me. The sound was unmistakable. Something heavy was being dragged across the floor, slow and deliberate. I stood there, paralyzed, as the dragging sound moved toward the far end of the attic, directly above my parents' bedroom. I forced myself to move, creeping down the hallway toward their room. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. The room was exactly as they'd left it, the waterbed still rippling slightly as if someone had just gotten up. The dragging sound stopped abruptly, and the phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice was urgent, almost panicked. "Clara, something's not right. I don't know what's going on, but you need to be careful. Call the police if you have to." I tried to respond, but the line went dead. I lay down on the waterbed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. I bolted upright, my heart racing. I ran to the door and flung it open, but no one was there. The porch was empty, the street silent. I called out for Ethan, but there was no response. I went to his room, my unease growing with every step. When I opened the door, my blood ran cold. The room was spotless, his bed neatly made, his gaming console turned off, the controller wrapped in its cord and placed neatly on the desk. It was as if no one had been in there for days. But I had heard him. I had heard him playing his game, shouting, just minutes ago. The phone rang again, shattering the silence. This time it was in the kitchen, exactly where I'd left it the first time. I answered, and it was Daniel again. "The call dropped," he said, his voice shaky. "I've been trying to reach you." Are you okay? I told him everything. The screeching, the dragging sound, the empty room. He listened in silence, then said, "Clara, I think you need to get out of there." As I hung up, I heard the knocking again, louder this time. I looked out the window, but the porch was still empty. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I walked around the side of the house, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. No one. I was about to go back inside when I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the porch light, stood a figure. It was tall, too tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were black, glossy, and reflective, like a cat's in the dark. But the most horrifying thing was its smile. It stretched from ear to ear, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching me, that grotesque smile frozen on its face. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. Something told me that if I did, it would chase me and I wouldn't stand a chance. So I did the only thing I could think of. I walked back inside, slowly, deliberately, as if nothing was wrong. I locked the door behind me and retreated to my room, where I spent the rest of the night huddled under the covers, clutching my phone and praying for morning. When the sun finally rose, the house felt different, lighter, safer. My parents returned later that day, and I told them everything. They didn't believe me, of course. They said it was just my imagination, fueled by the stress of being alone and the spooky atmosphere of Halloween. But I know what I saw. And even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. Because in Black Hollow, the shadows never stay empty for long. It was the spring of 2008 when my friend Javier and I embarked on a month-long backpacking trip across Europe. We started in a bustling city in the north, weaving our way through quaint villages, sprawling forests, and historic towns. By the time we reached our final destination, a sun-drenched coastal city in the south, we were exhausted but exhilarated. Little did we know, our journey would take a dark turn. Our troubles began when our bus broke down in the middle of nowhere, delaying our arrival by several hours. By the time we reached the hostel, it was well past midnight. The staff informed us that they had given away our beds, assuming we weren't coming. They assured us it wasn't a problem and directed us to another property they managed, a small, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was a cramped space with 2 bedrooms filled with bunk beds, clearly meant for budget travelers. We were too tired to argue, so we accepted the arrangement. The first 2 nights were uneventful. We shared the apartment with a lively group of travelers from Spain who were kind enough to include us in their late-night escapades. We laughed, drank, and explored the city together, making the most of our final days abroad. But on our last night, everything changed. The Spaniards left early that morning, and by evening, a new group arrived, 10 men and 1 woman, all from a neighboring continent. They spoke little English, and our attempts at conversation were met with polite but distant smiles. Javier and I didn't think much of it. We were used to the transient nature of hostels and figured we'd keep to ourselves. That night, we returned to the apartment around 2 a.m., exhausted from a long day of sightseeing. The others were still out, presumably enjoying the nightlife. An hour later, they stumbled in, loud and clearly intoxicated. They clambered into their bunks, and within minutes, the room was filled with the sounds of snoring. All except one. A man in the top bunk, across from mine, remained awake, his face illuminated by the faint glow of his phone. I tried to ignore him, closing my eyes and willing myself to sleep. But just as I was drifting off, a bright flash startled me. I opened my eyes to see him pointing his phone directly at me, the camera flash blinding in the darkness. I turned away, hoping he'd stop, but he didn't. He kept snapping photos, the flashes punctuating the silence like tiny bursts of lightning. Then came the whispers, low, guttural murmurs in a language I didn't understand, interspersed with crude English phrases that made my skin crawl. I clenched my fists, torn between confronting him and avoiding a scene. But when he climbed down from his bunk and began creeping toward me, I knew I couldn't stay silent. He stopped just inches from my bed, his shadow looming over me. I could hear his shallow breathing, smell the alcohol on his breath. My heart pounded as I weighed my options. The apartment was isolated, and there was no staff or other travelers nearby. If things escalated, Javier and I would be outnumbered. I thought about screaming, about fighting back, but fear kept me frozen. What if his friends woke up? What if they were just as dangerous? After what felt like an eternity, he knelt on the edge of my bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip. That was the breaking point. I sat up abruptly, my voice trembling but firm. "What the hell is your problem?" I demanded. He didn't respond. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then, without a word, he stood and walked to the bathroom. I heard the door close, followed by the sound of running water. A minute later, he returned to his bunk and, within minutes, was snoring as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, fully dressed, my backpack within reach in case we needed to make a quick escape. Javier, oblivious to what had happened, slept soundly in the bunk below me. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, I shook him awake and told him we needed to leave. He asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. Not then. Not in that place. We caught an early train out of the city, and as the landscape blurred past the window, I finally told Javier what had happened. He listened in stunned silence, his face pale. We never spoke of it again, but the memory stayed with me. The flashes of light, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. To this day, I wonder what that man's intentions were. Was he just drunk and reckless, or was something more sinister at play? If he's out there reading this, I hope he knows this. I haven't forgotten. And if our paths ever cross again, he'll regret the moment he decided to target me. The first time I realized I was being watched, I was 14 years old. It was the summer of 2012, and my family lived in a quiet, unremarkable town called Willow Creek. Our house was small, tucked away at the end of a dead-end street surrounded by dense woods. It was just my mom, her boyfriend, my younger sister, Mia, and me. My mom and her boyfriend worked late shifts at a factory on the outskirts of town, so most nights it was just me and Mia at home. I didn't mind at first. It felt like a responsibility I could handle. But that summer, everything changed. It started with small things. I'd noticed footprints in the dirt beneath my bedroom window, even though I hadn't been outside. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of someone standing at the edge of the woods, just watching the house. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe one of the neighbors taking a walk. But deep down, I knew something was off. One evening, after my mom and her boyfriend left for work, Mia and I were in the living room watching TV. It was around 8 p.m., and the sun was just starting to set. Mia was curled up on the couch with a blanket, half asleep, while I scrolled through my phone. Out of nowhere, the power went out. The TV shut off, and the house was plunged into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and checked the breaker box, but everything seemed fine. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the back door. I froze. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone was testing the door to see if it was unlocked. My heart raced as I crept toward the door, flashlight in hand. I peered through the window, but no one was there. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw a shadow move across the backyard. It was tall and thin, almost like a man, but it moved too quickly for me to be sure. I locked the door and called my mom, but she told me it was probably just an animal and to stop worrying. The next few days were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Then, one afternoon, Mia and I were playing in the backyard when she pointed to the woods and said, "Who's that man?" I followed her gaze and saw a figure standing among the trees. He was too far away to make out his face, but I could tell he was staring directly at us. I grabbed Mia's hand and rushed her inside, locking all the doors and windows behind us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside. Footsteps, rustling leaves, even the sound of someone trying to open the windows. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. They searched the property and told me it was probably just a raccoon or a stray dog. I didn't believe them. A week later, something even more terrifying happened. It was late, around 10 p.m., and Mia was already asleep in her room. I was in the kitchen making a snack when I heard a loud thud coming from upstairs. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a knife from the drawer and slowly made my way up the stairs. The hallway was dark, but I could see that Mia's door was slightly open. I pushed it open further and saw her sleeping soundly in her bed. Relieved, I turned to leave, but that's when I noticed it. The closet door was wide open, and inside, the clothes were scattered everywhere, as if someone had been rummaging through them. I called the police again, and this time, they found something. Outside Mia's window, there were fresh footprints in the dirt, along with a cigarette butt and a crumpled piece of paper. On the paper was a crude drawing of our house, with a small X marked on Mia's window. The police took it seriously this time and increased patrols in the area, but they never found the man. The final incident happened a few nights later. I was in my room, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the closet. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the closet door. The scratching stopped, but then I heard something else, a low, raspy whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was talking to themselves. I bolted out of the room and ran to Mia's room, shaking her awake. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." I grabbed her hand and we ran downstairs, out the front door, and down the street to a neighbor's house. The neighbor called the police, and when they arrived, they found the closet in my room empty, except for a single item. Hanging on the doorknob was a necklace I hadn't seen in years. It was mine, but I had lost it when I was 10. How it ended up there, I'll never know. The police never caught the man, and we moved out of Willow Creek a month later. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. I keep the necklace in a drawer as a reminder of how close we came to something unthinkable. And every time I hear a strange noise at night, I wonder if he's found us again. This happened a few years ago during my summer break. I was staying alone at my family's house, a quiet, secluded place surrounded by woods. It was one of those lazy afternoons where I had just finished cleaning up my room after days of putting it off. Exhausted, I plopped down on the couch in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV before settling on a video game to pass the time. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the distant chirping of birds outside. That's when I heard it, a sharp, insistent knock on the front door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and we rarely got visitors out here. I hesitated, my mind racing. I've always been a cautious person, maybe even a little paranoid, so I grabbed the fireplace poker from the corner of the room and crept toward the door. Peeking through the side window, I saw a man standing on the porch. He looked to be in his early 20s, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, a baseball cap, and jeans. He was holding a duffel bag in one hand, and his other hand was shoved deep into his pocket. Something about him felt off. His posture was too stiff, his movements too deliberate. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, hoping he'd just leave, but he didn't. Instead, he knocked again, harder this time, and then he started peering through the windows. My stomach churned. I ducked down, crawling behind the couch to hide. I didn't want to confront him. I didn't even want him to know I was home. Then, I heard him pull out his phone. He muttered something under his breath, too low for me to make out, but it sent a chill down my spine. A few moments later, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the creak of the back door opening. My heart pounded in my chest. How was that possible? The man was still on the porch, or at least I thought he was. I held my breath, clutching the fireplace poker tighter as I heard footsteps shuffling through the kitchen. From my hiding spot behind the couch, I could see a second man entering the house. He was taller, dressed in all black, and carrying what looked like a crowbar. My mind raced. Were they working together? Was this some kind of setup? The first man must have been a distraction, while the second one found a way inside. I cursed myself for not double-checking the locks earlier. The two men moved through the house with unsettling precision, rifling through drawers and cabinets, tossing anything of value into a large trash bag. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The TV was still on, the faint sounds of the video game echoing through the room. One of the men paused, glancing toward the living room. "Someone's here," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "The TV's on. They're hiding." My stomach dropped. I could feel their eyes scanning the room, searching for me. I pressed myself further into the shadows, praying they wouldn't find me. The taller man took a step closer, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He was inches away from the couch now, close enough that I could hear his breathing. I shut my eyes, bracing myself for the worst. But then, miraculously, they moved on. They headed down the hallway toward the bedrooms, their voices fading as they disappeared from view. I knew I had to act fast. While they were distracted, I crawled out from behind the couch and made a break for the back door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob, but I managed to slip outside without making a sound. I ran as fast as I could, cutting through the woods toward my neighbor's house. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't stop until I reached their property. I found Mr. Thompson, my neighbor, in his backyard tinkering with his truck. He took one look at me, pale, sweating, and out of breath, and immediately knew something was wrong. I explained what had happened, and without hesitation, he ushered me inside and called the police. While we waited, I pulled out my phone and started recording. From the safety of Mr. Thompson's house, I could see the two men leaving my property. They were carrying the trash bag, now bulging with stolen items, and heading toward a beat-up sedan parked down the road. I zoomed in, capturing their faces, the car, and the license plate. It wasn't much, but it was something. The police arrived within minutes, and I handed over the footage. They assured me they'd do everything they could to track down the intruders. A few days later, I got a call. They'd been caught trying to pawn some of the stolen items at a local shop. Most of our belongings were recovered, though a few things, like my mom's jewelry, were never found. The whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about how calculated it all seemed, the way they'd worked together, the way they'd known exactly where to look. It made me wonder how long they'd been watching the house, studying our routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. Even now, years later, I still double-check every lock and window before going to bed. And sometimes when I'm alone in the house, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me from the shadows, just waiting for their chance to strike again. This story takes place in the spring of 2016. I was 22 years old at the time, fresh out of college, and had just moved to the bustling city of Crestwood to pursue a master's degree. My field of study was niche, and opportunities in my hometown were scarce, so I packed up my life and headed to the city, hoping to find work and start a new chapter. But Crestwood was expensive, and without a steady income, I couldn't commit to a long-term lease. For months, I bounced between cheap hostels and short-term rentals, living out of a suitcase and dreaming of stability. Eventually, I found myself at a budget hostel called the Willow Inn, located just a few blocks from the university where I was taking classes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was affordable, and I thought it would be a temporary solution until I landed a job. The hostel had a mix of travelers and long-term residents, and I ended up sharing a dorm room with 3 other people. 2 guys who were backpacking through the country, and a girl who was in town for an internship. They were all friendly enough, and for the first few days, things seemed manageable. But then there was him. His name was Victor, and he was staying in the dorm room across the hall. Victor wasn't a traveler. He was a local, in his early 30s, with a disheveled appearance and a nervous energy that made my skin crawl. He told me he'd been living at the hostel for months after his family kicked him out, and he had no plans to leave. At first, he seemed harmless, just another person trying to get by. But it didn't take long for his behavior to shift into something far more unsettling. It started with small things. He'd linger near the common area whenever I was there, pretending to read a book or scroll through his phone. But I could feel his eyes on me. If I went to the kitchen to make tea, he'd suddenly appear, offering to help or striking up a conversation. He'd ask personal questions, where I was from, what I was studying, whether I had a boyfriend. I tried to be polite but distant, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. One evening, I returned to the hostel after a late study session at the library. As I walked up the stairs to my dorm, I noticed Victor sitting on the steps, waiting. He smiled when he saw me and said, "I was hoping you'd come back soon. I wanted to make sure you were safe." His tone was casual, but the way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine. I mumbled a quick thanks and hurried to my room, locking the door behind me. The next day, things escalated. I went to a cafe a few blocks away to work on an assignment. About 20 minutes after I sat down, Victor walked in. He claimed it was a coincidence, but the way he stared at me from across the room made it clear he'd followed me. I packed up my things and left, but he trailed behind me, trying to make small talk. When I finally got back to the hostel, I went straight to my room and stayed there for the rest of the night. The breaking point came a few days later. One of the guys in my dorm checked out, and the next thing I knew, Victor had moved into the empty bed. I hadn't agreed to this, and neither had the hostel staff. He'd apparently begged them to let him switch rooms. That night, I lay in my bunk, fully clothed, clutching my phone and praying for morning to come. I could hear him breathing in the bed below me, and every sound made my heart race. At one point, I thought I heard him get up and move around the room, but I was too afraid to look. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. As I packed my bags, Victor watched me from his bed, his expression unreadable. When I zipped up my suitcase, he suddenly started crying. "Please don't leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what I'll do without you. I love watching you sleep. It's the only thing that makes me feel calm." My stomach turned as he continued. "I even took pictures so I could remember you. You're so beautiful when you're asleep." I froze. My hands shook as I turned to face him. "What did you just say?" I demanded. He didn't answer, but his eyes darted to his phone, which was lying on the bed beside him. Before he could react, I grabbed it and unlocked it. My heart sank as I scrolled through the photos. There were dozens of them, pictures of me sleeping, taken over the past few nights. Some were close-ups of my face. Others showed me curled up under the blanket. I felt sick. I deleted every single one, then threw the phone back at him and stormed out of the room. I reported Victor to the hostel staff, but they seemed more annoyed than concerned. "He's harmless," one of them said. "Just a lonely guy who doesn't know how to act around women." I didn't stick around to argue. I grabbed my suitcase and left, vowing never to set foot in the Willow Inn again. Looking back, I wish I'd done more. Filed a police report, warned other guests, anything. But at the time, I was too shaken to think clearly. Victor's words and actions haunted me for months, and even now, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. To anyone reading this, trust your instincts. If someone makes you uncomfortable, don't brush it off. And if you ever find yourself in Crestwood, steer clear of the Willow Inn. You never know who might be lurking in the shadows.